Welcome everyone, thank you for joining us. Today we're going to be exploring the psychology of video game violence with Dr. Sparks. Dr. Glenn Sparks is Professor of Communications at Brian Lamb School of Communications at Purdue University. Welcome to the circle, Dr. Sparks.
Hey, thanks for having me. My pleasure.
This is a topic, I know we talked off camera, this is a topic that's really hot. It's been hot ever since video games, I think, came out. Is video game violence. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the research you've done in this area?
Well, I've actually looked at the physiological effects of playing violent video games versus non-violent games. Generally, I've written a lot of theoretical analysis in terms of the appeal of violence in general. I've looked. We know, for example, that violent video games definitely are associated with increased arousal. So when people are playing a violent game, they become physiologically aroused. Their heart rate increases, their muscles tense up, their skin temperature drops, respiration rate may pick up. And when you have that kind of arousal effect, it sets up a person for emotional intensity. So whatever kind of emotional reaction the person may be experiencing in that context, and then shortly afterward, that emotion is likely to be intensified. And so if a person is victorious in that game context and feels good about that, the arousal that's in the body may actually intensify those positive feelings, and a person may come off of that experience feeling a kind of an emotional high that's particularly intense, more intense than it would be if the arousal was not present. The flip side of that, though, is that if something occurs in the period of time shortly after the game is over that causes a negative emotional reaction, well, that negative emotional reaction is also going to be more intensified above and beyond what it normally might be. So if a person gets into an argument or they get into a dispute, they may find that their anger is actually manifesting as rage. And so everything is just more amped up because of the physiological arousal component. And that's the thing I've been particularly interested in that context.
So it sounds like I'm a big rational thinker proponent. It sounds like it affects how we interpret and process information.
I'd say that's right. And you have to remember that in a violent video game context, people that enter into that are entering into a competitive situation normally. So they are trying to accomplish some goals, and if those goals are frustrated, then that can actually be an emotional event in itself. There's also, I also am increasingly interested in this context with a phenomenon that some people are talking about, and that's addiction to these games. So I've spent the last 3 summers, a substantial part of those summers in South Korea. And in South Korea, they have a very different kind of gaming environment than we do here in the U.S. There are just hundreds and hundreds of places where young people can go to play these violent video games online. And a lot of times people are describing that experience as one in which they become addicted to the context and the game. And there's even been, in some very severe cases, there's been people who go into that environment and they really lose touch with their physical needs. They don't eat, they don't drink, and it's in some cases they actually there have actually been some reported deaths of people that have just ignored their needs and have become so absorbed in that environment. That's extreme. I don't think we're talking there mainstream effects. That's the exception rather than the rule. But I am interested increasingly in addiction to all kinds of technology, including the violent video game scenario.
Well, that's going to lead me into about 10 other questions, but we'll take one at a time. I don't even know where to go. Before I get into some of these other differences, such as education, age, or culture, I'm setting you up for later. Do you know anything about the biological effects? Are they affecting our prefrontal cortex? Have they done fMRI studies while people are playing video games? Is there any kind of reduction of activity in the prefrontal cortex?
Yeah, there are some studies that have started to look at fMRI. Of course, the problem there is that that's a very expensive technology. I don't have access to that technology myself right at the moment, and I would say that the research in that area has been pretty slow. There are not too many people who can do it, but we do have some evidence that shows that these games are affecting that region of the brain, so we're starting to gain some understanding about what's happening when people are competing in that environment in terms of brain processes. I need to get more familiar with that literature myself in terms of what we've really uncovered. A lot of times, I think that my reading of that literature shows that there are certain areas of the brain we can compare it with different things, and we see things lighting up. Exactly what that means in terms of what's happening and in terms of being able to predict behavior after that, I don't think we've made a whole lot of progress in that area yet.
I guess for me, it reminds me, I know the taxi drivers that did that study a while back ago, and they saw actual physical changes in the brain. I think it was the hippocampus actually grew.
That's right. That's right.
So I'm just wondering, maybe with the video games, an obsessive amount, would that actually decrease the size of the prefrontal or increase the amygdala? I don't know.
I think there are some people working on that, but I think it's probably premature to make definitive conclusions about that. So.
Yeah, that sounds good to me. Oh, now we're going to go back. We're going to talk about a little bit more about that South Korea, and maybe talk a little bit more about specifics in regards to video game violence, and then obviously some of the results that you discovered. But does age matter at all? I mean, is it different for a 15-year-old compared to a 35-year-old?
Well, I would say that one of the main differences is probably just the attraction that people have to that kind of an environment. So young people today, being raised with this technology, it's part of their environment from the time that they're born. They're just more likely to get involved with it. A 35-year-old. Probably hasn't been exposed nearly to the extent that a young person is, and so they're just not going to be attracted to it. It's going to seem strange. It's going to seem more strange. They're not going to be as likely to get into it, I would say. So it definitely is a younger person phenomenon. I don't know of any studies off the top of my head. I certainly haven't done any which have actually compared systematically, processing that occurs with older participants in that research with younger participants. I don't know of any research that specifically looked at that comparison, but I would say it's a young person phenomenon, generally speaking.
So what are some of the things that you found out in your studies that said, wow, this is really fascinating, it's a surprise?
Well, I think we know that if you play a violent video game, that context and all of this is pretty straightforward. It extends just not beyond. It extends beyond violent video games to any kind of violent media exposure. When we are processing violent images and we're engaged in that kind of thinking, it primes aggressive thoughts. And so when we have people who play these games and then we ask them afterward to engage in thought listing procedures, or we give them essays to write, we find that people who have played violent video games are more likely to create violent stories. They are more likely to be thinking about aggressive behavior. And so it changes what you're thinking about and what behaviors you're likely to be generating and so forth. I think that that's a rather intuitive kind of finding. It plays into everything that we know about priming and the media priming certain thought processes and so forth. So that I think is a pretty important effect to think about in terms of how playing these games affects the thoughts of people. One thing that I am very interested in too in this context is desensitization. So we know that people who are playing these games, when they initially start experiencing violent scenarios, their emotional reaction to those scenarios is more intense than it is after they have played the game for a while and continue to experience those things again and again and again. The big question I think that we're of course interested in is whether or not there's a relationship and a link between desensitization to the media experience and desensitization to violence in real life. And that's, we have less research on that, but the research that we do have suggests that there may be a link there.
I think we're going to talk more about that media association in part 2.
Yep.
And this is the big question I think everybody always asks, and we've seen it a lot of times in the media. They always try to somehow create causation. I know there's one gentleman, I think it was David Chapman.
Yes.
So that's one of the names that pops up. There's another individual that actually used video games to desensitize himself to killing people. I can't remember. I think that was in Europe. But they're always, the question is, does it cause violence? Is it a better question to ask, does it cause violence, or is there a correlation with video games and violence?
Yeah. You may be thinking of David Grossman. David Grossman has really gone on the public record, and he has really attacked violent video games and tried to argue that there is a connection between playing those games and acts of violence in society, particularly mass shooting events by teenagers. I think that this is really an important question to address, and I think it's one of the most misunderstood issues in the research. When we go into the laboratory, we can sometimes set up situations where we find a causal connection between the kind of media that a person has been involved with in that short session and a response that might be considered to be a more aggressive response on a continuum. So in some of the studies that have been done, how much hot sauce does a person leave behind for the next person to come in and take? Well, leaving hot sauce behind for the next person as opposed to mild sauce, you could construe that to be an aggressive response or somewhat hostile. Well, we can find a causal connection in the laboratory between exposure to violent video games and those kinds of behaviors. That effect, though, there are two important things to note about that. That effect usually is statistically a very small effect. It is a statistically significant effect, but in terms of the size of the effect, it's not overwhelmingly large. If you think about any human behavior, and aggressive behavior certainly fits, human behavior is typically caused by multiple things. There's not just one thing affecting a person's aggressive response in a situation. Playing a violent video game may be one thing. So I think the way to think about this is, to what extent is this a risk factor for aggressive behavior? Just the same way we think of risk factors for heart attacks or risk factors for cancer. There's many things that can contribute. So when we see an article, playing a violent video game causes aggressive behavior, that does not mean that everybody who plays a violent video game is somehow more aggressive and going to go out and commit an aggressive act. It means that overall, when we do group comparisons, there is a non-chance difference in terms of aggressive behavior in that one group. It's a statistically small effect, and the extent to which leaving hot sauce behind or playing noxious noise in somebody's ears, the extent to which that might generalize to aggressive behavior outside the laboratory is really an open question, and it's very difficult to make an airtight argument that would argue that those effects in the laboratory are somehow going to translate into meaningful aggressive responses in the real world. There's some indication that they might, mild forms of aggression. So we observe kids maybe more inclined to get into shoving matches on the playground or hitting each other and that kind of thing. But serious aggression, like taking up a gun and shooting a lot of people. I think David Grossman's case and argument there is stretched well beyond what the evidence allows us to say at this point.
So it's more hyperbole almost.
I think so. And it's interesting. I would say in Grossman's case, he has placed a lot of emphasis on the the shooting skills that children might learn while playing violent video games. And I was asked several years ago by the Center for Successful Parenting in Indianapolis, who was working with David Grossman, to be a consultant on one of the experiments that they were planning to do. And the whole gist of that study was to try to show that there was a link with the marksmanship skills that kids might learn in a video game context and their tendency then to be able to shoot real weapons more accurately. And I never actually, I wrote a paper for them, a consulting paper, but I never actually did the research. And the reason why, I pointed out to them, there are all kinds of organizations that try to increase marksmanship skill in children. So playing violent video games, it may increase marksmanship skill, but probably not as well as actually formally training marksmanship skills. That really isn't probably the big issue in terms of mass shooting episodes that we have in American culture. The big issue is motivation to engage in that behavior. Marksmanship skill probably isn't the key thing. It's probably what is motivating children to take up weapons and do that kind of thing. And I think we have a long way to go before we can say that playing video games, violent video games, is actually leading to that kind of behavior. Obviously, on the face of it, if it is, it's not doing it for very many people. Because there are literally millions of people playing those games, and these kinds of episodes, fortunately, in American life, are not too frequent. They're more frequent than they ought to be, but they're not real frequent.
Well, the Call of Duty makers are probably smiling at this interview. Quick question for you. We looked at that. We looked at the causation. You mentioned desensitization earlier. So, okay, let's say it doesn't cause the violence. So it doesn't cause them to hurt someone else or kill them at the worst. But may it desensitize them about hitting somebody and feeling some kind of level of empathy or some kind of feeling of remorse?
Yes, I think this is probably one of the stronger effects, actually. It's maybe a more pervasive effect than an effect on aggressive behavior. The law of emotional desensitization works in all kinds of different areas. So psychologists employ this to desensitize people from fears and phobias and anxieties. And so we can learn to desensitize to things that we want to desensitize to with repeated exposure to the same thing. And it works this way too. It works to desensitize us to things that we might not want to desensitize to. So I think we know pretty clearly that exposure to violent video games and exposure to media violence in general does emotionally desensitize people to the point where, with repeated exposure, they are not going to react with the intensity of negative emotion that they reacted with the first time they saw something. So that makes it easier for people to consume this kind of violent entertainment. If it's not causing as an intense emotional reaction that's negative, that kind of damps down, they're able to deal with it and tolerate it. And in fact, we know that one of the consequences of this desensitization effect is perceptual as well as emotional. So when we show people, when we engage people in this kind of entertainment on, say, the first day of the week, and they do it every day, and then they engage in it at the last part of the week, and we expose people to the same thing on the first day versus the last day, and then look at it as a function of their exposure during the week. People don't see the same amount of violence in the same scenario if they've been exposed to a week of this kind of stuff as they did on the first day. So there's a perceptual effect. They might rate the level of violence as being less, but they'll actually say, well, there weren't as many violent acts, there weren't as many violent scenes, there weren't as many violent events, weren't as many people killed. So in an objective sense, there's a perceptual dampening as well as the emotional impact that has. So we know desensitization happens, and there is some evidence that may translate to our reactions to violence when we see it in the real world. So there's a possibility that a person who is a really heavy consumer of media violence, who's very desensitized, that is, they're not really reacting emotionally to what they're seeing, they may become more calloused to violent events in the real world and not have that intense negative reaction that many people would who are not so exposed.
That's great. Thank you so much, Dr. Sparks. That was great insight. I think we answered a lot of the big questions for people out there.
Hello, my name's Matt, and I'm an addict.
My mom was addicted to prescription pills when I was very young, before I even turned 1.
Are you or someone you know struggling with alcohol or drug addiction? Has everyone given up on you or your loved one? The caring staff at Elite Care understands and treats you as a whole person. We offer individual and group therapy, holistic healing such as yoga, nutrition, and spirituality, medication management, and PTSD treatment. By building upon your strengths and rebuilding broken bonds, we help you begin a successful life. With our staff of licensed psychotherapists and doctors, you can be assured of the highest level of care. Elite Care is the best option for long-term rehabilitation from drugs and alcohol. Contact 888-511-0607 for more information.
Part 1, we had a great show talking about video game violence. Today we're going to be talking about the psychology of media violence. This is kind of an interesting subject for me specifically. I've always been curious. I'm a big fan of Criminal Minds, I'll have to admit, but I wonder, what is it doing to me? My wife's actually a bigger fan. What is it doing to her is another question. So what have you found in the research of media violence?
Well, I think one of the most extensive research paradigms in this area is the general paradigm of media cultivation. And George Gerbner, the late George Gerbner, was the pioneer in this area. And Gerbner, unlike a lot of psychologists who were studying the effects of violence on aggressive behavior, and we talked a little bit about that in part 1, Gerbner was interested really in the cognitive effects of exposure to media violence, and he was interested in those effects as they unfolded over a long period of time. So as a person consumed violent entertainment over a period of years, what was that likely to do? And so the major finding that comes out of that research is that people who consume a lot of media violence may come to actually believe that there's a greater chance that they may become involved in violence in real life, and they may fear criminal victimization more than a person who is not consuming all of that entertainment. And so he really emphasized that there's a psychology of fear that operates here. So a person who's watching a lot of this kind of entertainment may come to estimate that the probability of these kinds of events is much higher than in fact they really are. I had a graduate student who was working in this area recently, and we did a survey here in the Purdue community, a random phone survey of the population in the local community. And what we found was that when we asked people, what is the probability that any given person will die as a result of being murdered? Well, the actual probability is less than 1%, of course. It's a very small probability event. If you're a heavy viewer of CSI kind of entertainment, the heavy viewers actually estimated on the average that the probability of dying as a result of being murdered was 21%.
21%?
21%, and that is such an eye-popping statistic. When I shared it with my family, my brother-in-law said, "That's absolutely wrong. That has to be a wrong number. It's so outlandish." And he says, "I'll prove it to you. I'm going to call my girlfriend, who's an avid watcher of this kind of entertainment, and I'm going to ask her the question." He says, "Well, I'm going to put her on speakerphone," and put her on speakerphone, called her up, and asked her the question. And there was a very, very short pause on the phone, and her voice came back over, and she said, "Oh, I guess about 25%." And so he turned to me and said, "Well, I guess your research is accurate." It's hard to really digest some of those statistics in media cultivation, but that's that's one of the things that happens. The media cultivates us into certain views of reality, and if you consume a lot of violence, you probably, in the cultivation paradigm, you probably come to believe that the world is a more violent place than it really is. Gerbner called this the mean world syndrome. And it was one of the biggest effects that he talked about in terms of exposure to media violence.
That's really astonishing, 21%. Now, did you notice, or was any research done on the distinctions between the shows? I know shows such as Castle are a little bit more lighthearted. Criminal Minds is very intense. Were there any distinctions made about those shows in regards to the degree?
Well, we actually studied in that particular study. We looked specifically at what we called the CSI genre programming, and we contrasted that to programming that was not violent, in particular. So we haven't really gotten into research that makes nuanced distinctions between particular kinds of violence. I think that's a very interesting question, and that would be something that would be very interesting to study. But I haven't actually done research like that myself.
Now, aside from altering perception of reality, is there any causation found here, or any kind of correlation found with people committing violent acts?
Well, I think that, again, like the video game violence literature, the television literature and film literature is very similar. That the evidence for that is that there is a causal connection between the consumption of this kind of violence and aggressive behavior, but it's a very small effect. So statistically, it's not the case that we have to worry that a person who's consuming lots of media violence is necessarily going to be a very aggressive person. That simply does not. That is not borne out with the data. So there's a small effect, but media violence or aggressive behavior is a behavior that is influenced by a lot of different things. And again, I think the way to think about it is there's a risk factor here. If you are a heavy consumer of media violence, you put yourself at a somewhat higher risk in terms of aggressive responses than a person who is a low consumer of media violence. But media violence in itself is probably not anywhere near the most important contributor to aggressive behavior in society. So if you want to talk about it in risk factor terms, substance abuse is a much bigger predictor of aggressive behavior than media violence.
That's probably a really good point. I had some questions in the last show that I kind of refrained from asking you until this show, because I know it seems that media violence and video game violence do have some similarities. Did you notice any education levels having an impact, or upbringing, relating themes, anything like that, or culture?
Yes,
maybe?
Yeah, education level is a significant predictor just in terms of levels of exposure to this kind of entertainment. So exposure tends to vary according to general socioeconomic status. Higher SES populations or samples are not as likely to systematically expose themselves to violent entertainment. It's a more popular commodity at the lower SES levels. So the exposure, if you don't have exposure to begin with, then any of the risk factors are likely lessened. So that is something that we have found.
How about resonating themes in their upbringing, such as single-parent homes, alcoholism, anything like that?
Yeah, those things are all predictors of increased television watching, and in general, the more television you watch, the more violence you're going to see. I can just share anecdotally, and this is backed up by the research literature. My wife is a developmental therapist here in the Lafayette community, and she actually visits people's homes. She serves children from 0 to 3, and she does developmental therapy with them. Her report is that when she goes to any given home, the television set is always on. And she often has to ask parents to turn it off. They wouldn't even think to turn it off while she's doing therapy with their child. Television is ubiquitous. It is everywhere. it is more likely to be present again in the lower SES environment than it is the higher SES environment. So I think that does present a risk factor there for that population sample.
You're absolutely right. It is ubiquitous. I went to the gas station. There was a TV going on with the news. I hate to be candid. I went to the restroom, and there's a TV again. It's like, can't get away from this thing.
It's everywhere, and this is another effect that I'm interested in, and that's probably another program topic. But we're taking our public spaces and we're privatizing them. we're making them more private media experiences. So.
Yeah, and human nature is always fun. They always ask the question, can we, but never should we.
Yeah.
Did you see anything in regards to culture?
I
know you mentioned South Korea.
Yes. South Korea is an interesting case study because, 15 or 20 years ago, they really decided to go all out and transform their society technologically. And so they may be slightly ahead of the United States in terms of seeing some of the problems associated with technology, although I think we are seeing them as well. They may be seeing them at greater levels. For example, they have in South Korea, they have addiction camps, very, very common, where teenagers who are addicted to media are having to go technology free, and they go for 2 weeks, and they sort of get therapy, away from their media devices. And in Seoul, Korea, there just are literally hundreds of places where young people can go and consume entertainment of all kinds, and a lot of that is violent. So there may be some cultural differences here. I think that one of the things that it's important to keep in mind about media violence, though, is that the production of media violence from the standpoint of the Hollywood entertainment industry is really driven, I think, by the fact that the marketplace is global. They are not producing violent entertainment simply for the United States. The entertainment that they're producing that's violent is often violent because they know that violence translates well when it goes across cultures. It's very cheap to produce, generally speaking, and this is a point that George Gerbner often made. It's cheap to produce. It doesn't require a lot of creativity. And when you get it into another culture, it translates very well. So there's not, it's, people understand violent scenarios as they're unfolding in the entertainment context. And so one answer to the question of why we have a lot of media violence has to do with that economic formula. It's not necessarily because people inherently are drawn to media violence as a particularly favorite or popular commodity that they're seeking out. It turns out that media violence is not actually terribly popular as a commodity in the entertainment business. It's produced for these economic reasons, but people would much rather watch some other genre, generally speaking. And I've actually done one experiment where we took the violence out of a violent film, and we looked at what effect that had on people's overall enjoyment level of the movie, and in fact, it had none. So the nonviolent version of a full-length feature film, in this one experiment that I did, it turned out the violence was playing absolutely no role in terms of the enjoyment levels that people reported, their estimates of the quality of the film, how likely they were to want to see the film again, a whole host of questions that we asked them. The absence of the violence did not cause the film to suffer in any of those areas, and that's a result that has been replicated many times in the literature.
I think you just crushed Tarantino's heart there.
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
well.
Well, that's not to say that there aren't individuals. There are some individuals who are very motivated to seek out violent entertainment. So we're talking very generally here. There's obviously individual differences here, and so some people do really enjoy that kind of entertainment and seek it out. But in general, that's not the case.
What's your insight or opinion about some psychologists say we like the violent shows because it's a safe way of looking at this very dangerous subject matter. Since we are remote, it's okay over here.
Yeah, I think there may be something to that. I am inclined to say that I think one of the more likely things that's going on is that because of the level of violence in our society and the fact that the news media really cause us to be exposed to violence more than we are in our normal daily course, and maybe, in Gerbner's terms, cultivating a violent world. One reason we may be seeking out this kind of violent entertainment is because most of the time in these shows, the law enforcement people win out. The bad guys are captured, the criminals are apprehended, and I think a lot of times people are drawn to this kind of entertainment because they want to see justice. And generally, the world that Hollywood gives us when it serves up violence is a just world. So justice triumphs over evil, so to speak. And that may be one reason why people are inclined to tune into a lot of this, because it's a way of assuring themselves that, if violence does happen, everything will turn out well in the end.
That's actually an interesting point. I don't know, maybe for future research it might be interesting to look at the graying that's happening between the good and the bad in some of these shows. It's kind of hard to distinguish. Is that really a good guy? Some of the behavior patterns, Batman, I think, was one of them. As much of a fan I am of Batman, it was really kind of hard to distinguish the good guy and the bad guy on that.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, and that gets into another area of research that I've done a lot of work on, and that is the extent to which violent entertainment and frightening entertainment actually induces anxiety. If there isn't a just resolution in these programs, that kind of leaves people perhaps feeling anxious about the world around them and the possibility that that justice isn't going to win out, and crime is spreading, and I'm more at risk. So I think you're right. I think as that kind of entertainment theme emerges, it creates different effects possibly. Yeah.
So your action that makes me think about Halloween.
Yes.
Because Jason never dies.
That's right.
That creates a lot of anxiety. Interesting. Yeah. Well, wonderful insight once again. And if people want to get a hold of some, you have a book out there, if I remember correctly?
I do. I have a book called Media Effects Research, a basic overview, and that is a general survey aimed at undergraduate students, a general survey of media effects theory and research. And in fact, the 5th edition is just out a couple of days ago. So,
perfect timing. A lot of our audience are psychology fans as well as students. Thank you so much again for that great insight, Dr. Sparks. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Remember, our motto is simple. Wherever there's psychology involved, we are there. We'll see you next time. And also catch our web TV show, Circle of Insight, on therapycable.com.